Before this next series begins, I wanted to stop here for a moment at the threshold between what I've just finished and what I'm about to begin, because I don't think I'm done with the last series. When the Future Won't Hold was never about despair. It was never simply about burnout or uncertainty or the vague feeling that the world is hard right now. It was about something more precise than that, and it was about what happens when futurity itself begins to collapse, when the future no longer arrives as invitation or shelter or recognisable shape, when it stops feeling like a place you are moving toward and starts feeling like fog, debt, threat, extraction, blankness, and so on. For some of us, that collapse is not metaphorical. For some of us, the future has always been difficult to inhabit, not because we lack imagination, and not because we are broken, but because the world we were handed was never built to hold the lives we are actually living. That was the terrain of When the Future Won't Hold. It was about what it feels like to live in a world where there are no mirrors in which you recognise yourself and no windows through which to imagine a future that can actually hold. When I came to the end of that series, I found one question was still standing there waiting for me. Not just, what does this collapse feel like, but what produces it? What kind of world makes that condition so common that entire populations begin to experience the future not as possibility but as pressure? What kind of system turns continuity into privilege? And who benefits when more and more people can no longer imagine themselves forward? That is where Priced Out of Personhood begins. Not as departure from the last series, but as its continuation. If When the Future Won't Hold sat inside the lived experience of collapsed futurity, Priced Out of Personhood turns toward the machinery underneath it, the policies, the institutions, the markets, the administrative logics, the moral vocabulary, the whole architecture that makes human life increasingly conditional. And because one of the things I keep returning to is, for a great many people, the future does not fail to hold because we are pessimistic. It fails to hold because the structures around us have been organized in ways that make continuity fragile. When housing becomes unstable, the future contracts. When healthcare becomes conditional, the future contracts. When education becomes debt, the future contracts. When support is treated as overhead, the future contracts. When accommodation is framed as undue burden, the future contracts. And when the cost of food and fuel and insurance, medication, survival rises faster than the ability to live, the future contracts. When the care is rationed, when need is pathologized, when dependency is treated as moral failure, when every form of support has to justify itself in the language of budgets and efficiency and return on investments, the future contracts. At a certain point, collapsed futurity is no longer merely emotional, it's material, it's structural. It's often the most accurate reading of the conditions. That matters because we live in a culture that is very quick to pathologize what is often political. We are told to be resilient in the face of conditions that exhaust us. We are told to be hopeful in systems that are actively stripping away the material basis of hope. We're told to dream bigger whilst the floor is being removed underneath us. We're told to manifest, adapt, optimize, self-regulate, stay positive, hustle harder, make better choices. Whilst the actual machinery of life becomes more expensive, more hostile, more surveilled, and more conditional by the day. So, Priced Out of Personhood begins with a suspicion that these are not separate crises. The cost of survival, the shrinking of disability supports, the erosion of educational access, the quiet transformation of care into commodity, the reframing of autism as burden, risk, or a labour problem, The constant demand that vulnerable people prove we are economically worth supporting. These are not disconnected phenomena. They are connected expressions of the same underlying logic. A logic which human worth is increasingly filtered through market terms. A logic in which people are measured by cost, productivity, legibility, and compliance. A logic in which people are measured and personhood itself becomes to feel conditional. For autistic people, for disabled people more broadly, but especially for autistic people and Gestalt processors, that logic can become almost unbearably sharp because so much of autistic life is already shaped by misreading. One of the deepest currents running through When the Future Won't Hold is the experience of not seeing oneself reflected on the world's timeline, scrapes, developmental expectations, or promises. Of knowing, often with absolute certainty, that something in you is coherent, alive, intelligent, meaningful, and living inside systems that can read it, or refuse to. And that misreading is never neutral. When a system mistakes non-linear knowing for delay, relational intelligence for dysfunction, sensory depth for instability, or delayed analytic explanation for absence, it does not simply misunderstand you. It reorganizes your future around that misunderstanding. It lowers expectations. It narrows possibility. It withholds support. It reroutes educational pathways. It builds records that follow you. It turns accommodation into contest. It makes you prove and prove and prove again what is in you is real. And very often, before it has ever learned how to recognize your life, it has already begun discussing your existence in the language of cost. How much will this student require? How much intervention? How much staffing? How much liability? How much burden? How much remediation? How much productivity is lost? How much future independence is likely? How much will this child cost the system? How much will this adult cost society? That's not neutral language. That's not objective language. That is a moral language. As wearing spreadsheet as a mask. And once a life has been an expenditure, deficit, something profound begins to happen. The person starts disappearing behind the category. And that to me is what this next series is trying to name. Priced Out of Personhood. It's not just about money, though money is absolutely a part of it. It's about what happens when market logic becomes the dominant grammar through which society decides whose needs are reasonable, whose futures are investable, whose differences are tolerable, whose dependencies are forgivable, and whose lives are allowed to remain fully human. So over the course of this series, I'm going to be moving through autism, disability, education, debt, labour, precarity, and the broader economics of society, of survival. Some pieces will be personal. Some will be more explicitly political. Some will sit in rhetoric and language. Some will sit in policy and systems. But all of them will be asking versions of the same question. What happens when a world becomes so organized around extraction that it can no longer recognize life outside the ledger? What happens when support becomes negotiable? When care becomes conditional? When accommodation becomes suspect? When human need itself is treated as administrative inconvenience? And perhaps more importantly, what happens to people? To any people when they are accounted before they're known? So that line keeps kind of returning to me, counted before they're known. Because that is what so many of us have lived. Assessed before we're understood. We're categorized before we're encountered. Costed before we're cared for. Managed before met. Priced before recognized. And I think that's part of why these two categories belong together. When the Future Won't Hold asked what it means to live inside the wreckage of withheld futurity. especially when there are no mirrors, no windows, no script that can hold the person you actually are. Priced Out of Personhood asks, what built that wreckage? Who benefits from it? What systems sustain it? And what that might mean to refuse the terms entirely. And because the refusal matters, right? So the series is not an announcement of hopelessness, it's no surrender to despair. I'm not a doomer. Right? If anything, it's an attempt at clarity. And sometimes clarity is the first real form of resistance to say, no, this is not merely personal failure. No, it's not just anxiety. I don't need a pill for this. No, it's not simply a mindset issue. No, it's not what happens when individuals do not try hard enough. There's no bootstraps here. It's what happens when entire structures are built to sort human beings by economic usefulness and then call the sorting process neutral. So if you've ever had that feeling that the world sees you in your needs before it sees your humanity, if you've ever felt yourself translated into burden, disruption, overhead, accommodation, delay, risk, oof. And if you've ever felt yourself translated into things that you know just simply are not true, if you've ever known in your bones that the future was becoming harder to manage, imagine, not because you lack depth or desire, but because the conditions themselves were closing around you. And I hope you get something from this series. The series is for you. And if you've been with me through When the Future Won't Hold, then I want to say something kind of clear. We're not leaving that series behind. We're carrying it deeper. We're following the feeling into the structure. We are following the grief into the machinery. We are following the collapse of the system that made it profitable. So I thank you for being at that threshold with me, and I'll see you in the first piece.